Hello, and welcome to Breast Cancer Conversations, a podcast brought to you by survivingbreastcancer.org. I am Laura Carfing, breast cancer survivor and founder of survivingbreastcancer.org, a nonprofit organization providing community, education, and resources to empower those diagnosed with breast cancer and their caregivers from day one and beyond. Hello, my friends. Welcome to another episode of Breast Cancer Conversations. I am so glad you're here. What I've been saying lately is it's so nice to meet all of you, despite the crazy circumstances that we're in. Whoever thought breast cancer would bring us this close together? But I really feel like you guys are my tribe. You guys are my BFFs. I love coming week after week to provide content, share with you, and then also get to know you better. So if you're not already following us on social media, please do. I am on Twitter at what's my Twitter handle? SBC_ORG. And then also on Instagram, survivingbreastcancer.org, all one word. So definitely check that out. So we do weekly events. We have Movement Monday classes. We do Thursday Night Thriver meetups, all virtual. So no matter where in the world you are, you can always connect with us. You can find out more about our upcoming programs at survivingbreastcancer.org/events. Now, today I am so excited because we are bringing TJ Hills on the podcast, and she is going to enlighten us about estrogen gene testing. I've never heard about this before until TJ enlightened me, so we have a lot of information to dive into today. TJ is a breast cancer thriver herself, diagnosed 13 years ago with stage 3 breast cancer. She wrote a book, she's a prominent speaker, she started a foundation, she's just amazing all around. So let's dive right in. Welcome to the conversation. Welcome to Breast Cancer Conversations. I'm so excited, TJ, to have you on as a guest where we talk about all things breast cancer. And it's really just a great opportunity for us to, one, get to know each other a little bit better, though you have shared your story, so our audience does know a little bit about your background. I love this work because I get to meet some of the most amazing women and men and physicians and oncologists and thrivers, survivors, and you name it, who want to share their story and provide hope and education and resources for those who are listening. So I'm just so excited.
Thank you, Laura. I'm really honored to be here. Really excited. I have become a little familiar with your work, and I think it serves a really desirable niche, or a niche that people are just thirsty for. I, for one, have always thought that, longer term survivors need a lot of help that's not necessarily out there. So I just want to thank you for all the work that you're doing. And I'm really honored to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you. Giving back, I think, is something that's so fulfilling. It sounds like for both of us as well, where it's not just talking about our own personal experience, but how we can really help everyone who's been touched by breast cancer. So again, it's great that our worlds have intertwined despite the circumstances.
Well, in my case, it's become, a 13-year-long obsession. Shortly after I was diagnosed with an aggressive ER/PR positive breast cancer, I learned about estrogen metabolism gene testing. And basically since then, on and off for the past 13 years, to greater and lesser extents, my calling in life has been to spread this information to try and help both people who are diagnosed with breast cancer or those who are not, and help them not become diagnosed with breast cancer. So the calling and giving back is really a passion for me, and I think for a lot of other people.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you found out you originally had breast cancer?
I'll tell you how I found out, but I also want to point out that for about the 2 years prior to my diagnosis, I was really sick and ignoring it. I had started bleeding irregularly, which was really unusual for me. And I was becoming extremely tired, which was also extremely unusual for me. So I was basically sick, but I was also very busy. Type A, business, 3 kids, super mom. And I blew it off. So I never took the time to kind of figure out why these things were happening to me. When I was 43, I found a lump in my breast. I found it myself. And as you well know, that is mostly how younger women find it. It wasn't a self-exam. I actually just found it in the shower.
It's heartbreaking sometimes to hear how one night it could be nothing. And then the next morning we wake up, whether we're using our hands to wash ourselves or a loofah or something like that. And you just find wait, was this here before? I don't remember this being here before. And just being so in tune with your body to know that something is not right. Something is unusual.
I couldn't believe that I hadn't found it, right? Because then it was an obsession and oddly enough, when I found it, I wasn't that worried because 80% of all breast cancer patients, there's absolutely no cancer in my family at the time. That didn't turn out to be the long-term case, but at the time, there was literally no cancer in my family. So I was like very afraid of diabetes, for example, but I wasn't that worried about it. I had like a little cyst removed when I was 17, and I just thought, oh yeah, probably I was concerned, but I really wasn't worried and panicked like I should have been.
2 years prior, right? When we're just kind of, super mom and enthralled in our work and our careers and life, what were some of the symptoms that you were having? You were saying that you were ignoring some of the signs of just general health.
So, no, I was bleeding irregularly.
Oh, okay.
I was bleeding irregularly, which was very unusual for me. And I was really, really tired. And I'm not a tired person, right? Like prior to this whole experience, I was basically, like that little wind up rabbit in the commercial, the Energizer bunny.
Yes.
Like just keeps going. That was a very clear and urgent thing happening in my body, which I just blew off.
You discovered the lump yourself. What happened next?
A very long odyssey of being, I'm right outside New York City. I'm like basically just north of the Bronx. So I have some of the best hospitals and doctors in the entire country. And again, I wasn't really worried about it. So I basically did my initial discovery of what was going on with me here at local community hospitals where a lot of really important mistakes were made. So it took me a while to actually get down to some of the best hospitals in the country, if not the world. And so that's, and that's where I wound up having my surgeries and chemo, et cetera.
What were some of the challenges that you encountered initially?
I didn't react well to chemo. I basically kept having like rare side effects to everything. I had problems with my surgeries. I had really, really, what's it called? Neutropenia. So I had very bad neutropenia, and I wasn't responding to any of the drugs that would, raise my white blood cell counts. And finally, treatment was aborted. It was a big deal. And I'm sure that some of the things that I continue to deal with now, 13 years later, are because of basically the strength of the chemo that I was given.
Absolutely.
I mean, things are different now. I want to just, caution viewers or listeners out there to say that a lot of the personalized medicine, your response to certain drugs, tests that can tell you, how you respond to certain drugs, the dosages given, whether or not you even need them. None of those tests were available. When I was diagnosed, Oncotype testing had just come out, and my case was considered too severe to bother with the cost of Oncotype. So no physician would give it to me. In fact, I didn't get Oncotype testing until I was like 3-4 years out because it wasn't going to change the course of my treatment at the time.
Okay. At the time.
Now, I'm kind of like your crazy ex-girlfriend stalking. So I keep abreast of current breast cancer treatment all the time because, well, not just because of my work with, speaking to audiences and promoting estrogen gene testing, but I also do it because I had such a hard time. I'm always wondering, like, if I were diagnosed now, would that still have happened to me?
Even being 5 years out, actually, I had a follow-up with my own oncologist, and we were talking about the extensive lines of treatment that I've been on. I did not have a complete response to the chemotherapy, so I was given some additional oral chemo to take for 6 months. And, I feel like it's so toxic to our body. And I call it kind of like the whack-a-mole syndrome, where now I'm dealing with like cardiotoxicity for my heart. I'm dealing with a toxic liver because of all of the chemotherapies I've been on. And it's just like, gosh, okay, so if it's not the cancer, then it's all of these other things that are dovetailing after saving my life. it's almost like the clinical trials too can't keep up necessarily even with the standard of care, because there is such great findings and opportunities for people to get tested, find out more with the personalized medicine, find out exactly about their genes, their biomarkers, and all of these things to really have a tailored approach to how they're confronting a cancer diagnosis.
One of the things that I find really, really interesting about what's happening right now in terms of standard care is that I feel like we're on the cusp of how chemo is given to people really changing. So, for example, I was diagnosed, I was 43, I was done having children. And I think in the future, in the very near future, there's this middle group. So they're clear on what has to happen to menopausal women, and they're pretty clear on what has to happen to premenopausal women. What I think will happen in the relatively near future is that this in-between group of, yes, you're premenopausal, but you're done having children. You have had your children, and what I wonder, and again, I'm not a medical professional, I'm just a researcher and a stalker, is, for example, would in the relatively near future, would someone treat me and say, well, you're done having children and chemo is going to, destroy your ovarian function anyway. Would you rather have a hysterectomy or at least have a oophorectomy and not have chemo? And I'm very hopeful about that. I think like in terms of what you were talking about, like liver toxicity and cardiotoxicity, and in my case, like the total destruction of my thyroid and a lot of other things, a lot of side effects that women are dealing with forever, right? I mean, I think you can get better. You can make both your cardio and liver toxicity
absolutely
a lot better. But, there's still consequences to chemo and radiation and surgery. But, surgery, the consequences are known to go away, dissipate eventually. But I just wonder if we're getting there soon. And that would be like a landmark difference.
When did you start becoming more in tune with the levels of estrogen in your body and how that was playing more of a role in not just your diagnosis, but like life afterwards too?
I had basically very poor care in the beginning, which, we had great consequences. So I'm actually a researcher by profession. And one of the things that I did after realizing how dire the consequences were of those choosing poor doctors or poor care, I went completely the other way. And I went and saw every best doctor in the city. I did tons of research, the best I could, and without researching on Google, because that I would not recommend that.
Right.
But I researched the physicians, and I researched the hospitals, and I researched what could happen. And I reached out to any physician who I'd ever admired in the past. And I'm originally from Chicago, and I wound up being introduced to my old internist to a bioresearcher, a biochemist called Dr. Veltman, who is an expert in nutrigenomics. And that was at the time, again, like 13 years ago, very, very few people were using nutrigenomics, but he was actually working with the military. And he had been working on a rather large cohort of women who were exactly, this common variety, garden variety breast cancer. So exactly like your and I's diagnosis. And what he had been doing so nutrigenomics is basically the study of how nutrition and environment and supplements or compounds can change the behavior of a gene for better or for worse.
Okay.
So these are not cancer genes. These are, in my case, estrogen genes are actually metabolism genes. Okay. And so basically, as soon as I met him, he started teaching me about estrogen, of which I knew nothing. Like, I didn't know anything about estrogen until after my cancer diagnosis. And so the very first thing that Dr. Veltman asked me, when I was on the phone meeting him, was, have you had any irregular bleeding?
Wow.
So it turned out that, irregular bleeding is one of the clues that something is amiss with your estrogen metabolism function. And so I learned about it through him. I was given an estrogen gene test by him, basically while I was waiting for chemo. And the results came back and I had damage on every single gene. And not only did I have damage on every single gene, I actually had so much damage that some of the genes were missing. Like they weren't even functioning. They weren't functioning poorly. They were just gone. They had been so damaged.
Wow.
So that was my introduction to estrogen gene testing.
Yeah, I've never actually really heard of it until you and I started talking and you sharing your story with our community members.
So estrogen is not estrogen. Estrogen is a group, right? Estrogen is referring to a whole group of hormones. And the strongest one is estradiol. And when people say estrogen, they normally just mean estradiol. That's really what they're saying. Estradiol is mostly produced in our ovaries, but a weaker form of estrogen is produced in our fat. And that's one of the reasons why obesity is on the list of breast cancer risk factors. Because if you go through the list of breast cancer risk factors, most of them are estrogen related. So unless you've had like some kind of chemical damage, like, serious chemical damage, you're living next to a factory or a polluted stream, or you've been radiated in the past, apart from like some kind of very strong environmental exposure to toxins, everything on that list is related to estradiol. And so I didn't just research estrogen in my, so basically, again, 13 years ago, they didn't have the specification of the tests in your diagnosis and prognosis. So what I was told when I was diagnosed is that if I successfully completed, cut, burn, and poison, right? Or cut, poison, and burn, that I would have a 30% chance of making it 5 years. And if I didn't do that successfully, I would have a 70% chance of the cancer coming back within the 5 years. And to me, those odds were just like outrageous, right? I had young children. I mean, I had no cancer in my family. And I was like, what do you mean if I do all this, I still have a 30% risk?
Right.
So when I kind of came out of my, treatment coma, which took a really long time, I mean, I was really sick, really, really sick. I basically took all the research skills upon which I had built a really successful business, and I just applied it to this. I'm like, well, how can I cut down that 30%? And as I said, I didn't get my oncotype testing for several years. My oncotype testing basically showed like 15%, still sort of still unacceptable.
Sure.
And I actually just recently had a test called the breast cancer index test, which no one had ever given me. And I've been on drugs now for 13 years. I took 10 years of tamoxifen, and I've been on an aromatase inhibitor for, closer to 2. And I'd never had the test. So even when that came back, it came back the same. It was around 15%. So, my plan is that I'm on drugs forever.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you were on tamoxifen or an aromatase inhibitor. So
I was on tamoxifen for 10 years, and I've been on an aromatase inhibitor for a little over 2. Yes. Well, like 2.5 now, I guess. Yeah.
I'm on an aromatase inhibitor currently, and it's prescribed for 10 years. And I also get a Lupron shot to shut down my ovarian function. So, some combination thereof. So my body is not producing the estrogen. And that's when I started having those conversations with my doctors of, well, maybe I should have a hysterectomy and have everything removed. And then maybe I can also negate having this terrible shot every month. And then also maybe get off of the aromatase inhibitors. And that's when they started educating me on the role that estrogen plays and that it comes from your adrenal glands or some of your fat and other things. So even if I were to go through the surgery, I would still need to be on aromatase inhibitor. When
I was diagnosed, they didn't have the 10-year data. And I didn't finish chemo. So my oncologist was like, okay, well, let's go for 5 and then see if you switch at 5. But I was tolerating tamoxifen really well. And I hadn't tolerated all kinds of other stuff. So we just kept going with it. I had a full hysterectomy because tamoxifen was making my uterine lining like too thick. So I had to start getting monitored quarterly. Like basically surgical monitoring quarterly. And at some point I was like, a friend of mine died of ovarian cancer. I was like, that's it.
Well, I'm glad that the hormonal therapies have, you're tolerating them very well, which is wonderful. And that they can be utilized for, 10 plus years. How does that play into the research that you're discovering now with the role that estrogen plays in your metabolism?
Just going back to that 70-30 risk, because
Mm.
those are the bell curve numbers that they still have. Every other test would be personalized information. But, still the bell curve is 70-30 for people in our 2B, 3 garden variety breast cancer. If you look at, I don't want to get super technical, but basically the way estrogen is metabolized in your body, let's just say one path goes down the receptor part, which is where the tamoxifen and the aromatase inhibitors are blocking it and playing a role. And there's another path, which is where the metabolism comes into play. And so basically, if you delve into the research without getting too technical, improving your estrogen metabolism function, which is pretty simple, I'll switch over and talk about that, but improving it will, through the nutrigenomics. So what you're doing is you're improving your gene behavior for the better is down that other line that's untreated. So when I started doing my research, it became pretty clear that path may be where a lot of the recurrence is coming from, because the estrogen receptor path is taken care of. The other path is not. So maybe the 30%,
Interesting.
This is where it's playing a role. Now, cancer's a lot more complicated than that. It's a very wily disease. So I'm grossly oversimplifying, but this is known research, and it's been known for a really long time. They haven't had the gene testing, but they have been able to test it through urine. And they basically know that women who have better estrogen metabolism, basically their mortality rate is better. They've done a lot of work on this for many, many years. So this is not like what I'm promoting. What I'm promoting is finding out about your genes and improving your function. These are old studies where they just know that the women who survived longer, they just had better metabolism. They weren't trying to improve it. They just had it. It wasn't as damaged as, for example, someone like me. They didn't have the tests to monitor all that. When I started exploring, well, how am I going to make that 30% ratio better? I investigated a lot of different work, but this body of work intuitively just made more sense to me. And it was a lot deeper. Like there had been a lot of work done for decades. And the cherry on the top was really the gene testing, which could delineate exactly what was going on. And so if you look at, for example, at the gene testing and you look at that American Cancer Society, here's all your estrogen risks, every single one of them basically goes back to genes.
So when you did this test and found out that your estrogen or estradiol genes were severely impacted, or as you were mentioning,
impaired.
Yeah. Thank you. When you receive that news, like in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, what do I have to do? How do I fix them? What does this mean? How did this happen? Right? As if cancer isn't bad enough. Now you're finding this. Oh, what was some of your reaction to that?
Well, I was really relieved because of the mystery of the cancer, right? Like there was no cancer running in my family. And when I got the results of the test, so everything made sense because I had very, very high estrogen exposures through drugs. And then when you see, and really importantly, estrogen metabolism dysfunction is implicated in all kinds of illnesses. So breast cancer is like the end of the line, but endometriosis, fibroid tumors, polycystic ovarian syndrome, like older unexplained infertility because they didn't have ultrasounds, right? So, it was probably fibroid tumors that were not severe enough to get diagnosed, but like hysterectomy, and so once I basically was given the test results and understood all about these conditions, which were rampant in my family, like rampant. Wow. This was running rampant in my family. And I had a lot of drugs, birth control pills for 20 years. I'd done IVF, I was a photographer. I, never used gloves in the dark room. I had like a ton of extra estrogen exposure. Plus I'm American, which, leads you basically surrounded by estrogens. It all made sense. And then I was really happy because, the treatments to improve it are really basic. You take a substance called Dimpro, which is basically concentrated broccoli. Dimpro is the active ingredient in the mustard family. So we're talking about broccoli, cauliflower, dandelions, and mustard. And
Wow.
so basically, if you take the supplement, it's like you're getting a room full of that every day. And that's one of the primary supplements proposed. And the other things are strong antioxidants like vitamin C and
Mhm.
fish oil. For
Okay.
me, that's like for someone who has, mutations or damage on every single gene. So, you're not asking a lot. The other thing is that, so when I started this, so you don't do any of this until you're done with treatment. But as I said, when I went through chemo, I immediately had, chemical menopause, which was severe. It's as if you had had an emergency hysterectomy,
Oh, night and day. It's like flipping a switch.
Right.
It's
And
terrible.
so I was having horrific hot flashes on top of, everything else that was going on. So I'm taking the Dimpro, things got better. And then what happened is, like I switched brands because I didn't know, right? And my hot flashes were out of control. And I'm like, what is going on? And then it took me like a while, but I finally pieced it together. It's like, oh, because supplements are unregulated, right? So cheaper brand. You can't generalize and say cheaper or worse, but
Right.
basically I wasn't taking the super expensive brand. And then my hot flashes were much worse. And so DIM was
Hmm.
actually dramatically improving my hot flashes.
Now, was this recommended to you from Dr. Veltman?
Veltman. Yeah.
When okay.
So all of this was from the expert in nutrigenomics, but eventually I wound up, following up with integrative health physicians because they're the ones who knew at the time
Hmm.
a little bit more about nutrigenomics. I'm promoting that
Hmm.
every woman in the world ought to be taking this test so that they can plan out, their fertility life cycle. How long are they going to take drugs or not take drugs or do, now you can do egg freezing, which I think is
Hmm.
super cool. And there's all kinds of super cool birth control pills, which, not pills, but interventions, that don't have
Sure.
hormones.
How do you advocate, or how would you tell women listening or watching this now? How do they start having that conversation? Who should they talk to? Is it their primary care, their oncologist? Do they just
They
go in
should
and ask for the test?
they should go to my website, betterestrogen.com. And I have a handful because my standards are pretty rigorous. So I only
Mhm.
have a handful of companies that I say, like, here, go get this test from them, because then when the test results come out, they're going to say what exactly you should do.
Mm.
So because a lot of physicians don't know about nutrigenomics. So if you ask your primary care or your OBGYN or whomever, it doesn't have to be a doctor. It could be a naturopath or a
Sure.
chiropractor or a nurse practitioner or, anyone basically with
Yeah.
a license can order these tests. The other thing is that some of the testing companies actually have virtual doctors. So you have a virtual visit, you get your test, and then you go through it with them.
Okay.
And the only ones on my website basically have a map of, well, this is what you do, this is what's wrong, this is what you do about it.
Fascinating. Excellent. Thank you for that resource. We'll definitely link to that so our viewers can find out more information. And do you know how expensive this is, or if it's something that's covered by insurance?
So no, none of these things, none of these tests are covered by insurance. It depends. If you have a doctor that's actually using it, a lot of them put together packages, so that can be quite
Mm.
expensive.
Hmm.
But the test itself runs between $100 and $300 in
What you
my
found.
experience. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the more information we have about our specific cellular makeup, our metabolism makeup, like all of those things really is just empowering. And, I had a call from my genetics counselor who said, from since 5 years ago, there's more panels we should be testing. Like, why don't you get back in here and why don't we do some more blood work? And so, it's one of those moments that kind of makes you pause because I don't really want to discover more necessarily, but at the same time I know, knowledge is power, and if there's something I can be pre-screened for earlier, whether it's, colon cancer or other things that might be familiar, I would rather just collect the information and then be able to make a proactive plan so that way I am taking the best care of my health as possible.
I think that the running out of how long it takes us to get to real personalized medicine is just going to take a long time, but we're getting there.
For myself as well, I was a strict vegan when I got diagnosed. And I was like, are you kidding me? I eat all the kale and broccoli in the world and I still got cancer, which has been a little bit of my platform of it can happen to anyone. It doesn't
Yeah.
discriminate. And, if rounding up even to 15%. I think the stats are around, about 10% are genetic or family history lines for why someone might develop breast cancer. But then what about the other 90%, right? So like you're talking about lifestyle, environmental factors, exposure to other estrogens or hormones. And so it really takes that, 30,000 foot view of, okay, what's your whole makeup? What is happening, from day one until your diagnosis? And it's probably inappropriate to say, I want to say, like, I'm a little envious that you figured this out because, so many of us are like, oh, no one knows why I got diagnosed and why this is happening. But it sounds like you're starting to put together those dots and putting the pieces together to figure out, these early signs with your menstrual cycles and the bleeding, and then how this could lead to where you are now understanding your specific environment with estrogen.
Well, I wouldn't be jealous. I wouldn't be jealous, but because I think cancer is really complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And so I strongly believe when I put all the pieces together of my own personal risk, and it's not just the drugs I took, it's, things very specific, like, I didn't have my first child till I was 36. I'm tall, all of these things get put together for your specific risk. But for me personally, learning about estrogen metabolism, seeing my family history, which is just loaded with the dysfunction, like really severely loaded with it, then my diagnosis made sense. And yes, that did give me comfort, because not just because the mystery was gone, but because I was taking these supplements, I could see they were having an impact on my body. And so I feel like I am doing something to mitigate that 30%, which is now 15%. And on the breast cancer index thing, it's 12.4, 12.9, whatever it is. Let's call it, 13, 14, 15. It's still a lot. Right. It's still a lot. But I think we don't know about cancer, right? Both of my parents wound up having their entire genomes tested. And between both of my parents, who both died of cancer, estrogen cancers, they did not have one single cancer gene, not one.
Wow.
And so, we may, and I take those panels every year too, and they may figure it out that really, there's all these genes and we just didn't know what they were.
We just didn't know. Yeah.
They might figure that out, but they also may, 10 years, 20 years from now, be able to categorically say, hey, most of this really is environmental, and it's about these genes getting switched on and these genes getting switched off.
This has been so educational, and I really appreciate you kind of enlightening myself and our listeners about the role estrogen plays in our body, how we can get tested to understand I'm probably messing up how you so eloquently said it. What was it? Estrogen metabolism? Is that the term? Real quickly too, before we kind of wrap up and conclude, I am curious because you did say that you wrote a book earlier as well. And so I do want to give you an opportunity. Is this information also in your book, or is your book taking a different direction?
No, my book is exactly about this. I have had a really hard time presenting this information because my foible is I will go really deep into the weeds as a researcher and everyone's eyes will glaze over. So during COVID, I got talked into editing. And finally I have a book. It's called Sex, Drugs, Babies, and Breast Cancer, The Health Benefits of Estrogen Gene Testing. And it's basically what we're talking about. Yeah. And I had a real editor who beat me up a lot. And I think the book is comprehensible for this.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well,
thank you for asking about it.
No, of course. I mean, just the more information we can get out there to people so they can explore and learn and ask questions and connect with you, whether it's through our website, because you shared your story with us, or directly through your website. Now, is Better Estrogen, is that your nonprofit or is that a separate organization?
No, it is. It's a nonprofit. It's okay. Better Estrogen Foundation. And what I do is I promote this because I think it's like critically important.
Is there anything we haven't covered? I feel like you were incredibly thorough and really giving us a lot to think about and digest.
Well, thank you. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to talk about my passion and also for running Surviving Breast Cancer, which is really filling a big gap. Because, I have always wanted there to be more support for long-term survivors because the whole idea, like, well, you're not dead. You're not dead. Stop complaining. Stop complaining because you're not dead is not a
right.
It's not a great medical.
What do you mean? You're not over it yet?
Yeah. Like what?
Well, this has been an absolute pleasure. TJ, thank you so much for joining us, and we will continue the conversation. So very nice. Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening to our show. I would like to acknowledge that all of the information on our podcast are from personal experiences and are not a substitute for professional medical advice. You should always contact your medical care team. And don't forget to follow us on social media. Again, handles are on Twitter, SBC_ORG, and on Instagram, survivingbreastcancer.org, all one word. And you can check out all of our events and programming at survivingbreastcancer.org. See you next week.